Karl Marx. Where to begin? A philosopher, an expert in law and ancient history, communist revolutionary, a rare essayist/debate bro hybrid, and user of the occasional, not-so-tactical N-word. Whether you like him or not, this OG radical edgelord had a hard time speaking freely. In fact, he was silenced. Not like that fake silencing where one of your tweets gets deleted and you make a 15-minute video about it to 4 million people.
Up yours, woke moralists. We'll see who cancels who.
No. Courtesy of his ideas, Karl Marx was branded the most dangerous man in Europe, and the powers that be meant it. He was banned from his homeland of Prussia, as well as France and Belgium, before he was finally allowed to take refuge in London. The UK was the birthplace of modern liberalism, and here, Marx was able to speak relatively freely. One of the places he would visit was Speaker's Corner in Hyde Park. Speaker's Corner is an old-school marketplace of ideas. It's where anyone can turn up unannounced and talk about whatever they want to, provided their speech is lawful. More on that later. It was used by Marx, George Orwell, Lenin. It was where the suffragettes held their first meetings and continued to do even after they were banned from the park in 1913. It was where 2 million people gathered to oppose the Iraq War in 2003, but how it gained its reputation as a place to speak freely is a bit surprising. From 1196 to 1783, long before people were talking about free speech, the northeastern spot of Hyde Park was the home of the Tyburn gallows, where over 50,000 people were executed. These events were completely open to the public. People would bring their kids, they would bring picnics, but not just because they wanted to watch people die. One of the other highlights of these executions was that when someone was condemned to die, they were allowed to make a speech. Which doesn't sound very exciting today, but back then, this was one of the only times when commoners were ever able to speak completely freely in public. They could criticize the government, they could shit on the monarchy, they could tell everyone about their fantasies of f***ing the Queen. They could confess their sins to a crowd full of strangers. Naturally, these events would often get spicy and end with fights or even riots. The hangings were eventually seen as too much of a public nuisance, and in 1783, the gallows were dismantled and moved to a local prison. But from then on, the park became a regular spot for protesters and public speakers. The first people to call it Speaker's Corner were the Reform League, who used the park to hold meetings advocating for universal suffrage. Well, suffrage for men anyway. As they started to gain popularity, the government started banning their events and eventually ended up locking the park completely. The result was 3 days of rioting, which forced them to reopen the space. After another government ban in 1867, 150,000 people marched to the park, and the police and troops refused to stop them. The Whig Home Secretary who put the ban in place resigned the next day. Finally, in 1872, the government passed the Parks Regulation Act, which declared that any person has the right to meet and speak freely in Speaker's Corner. But upholding this small wonder of the world hasn't always been easy. With the rise of online political content creators, critics have complained that the tradition of Speaker's Corner has been increasingly abused by people who are using the space not to engage with others, but to play to their audiences on the internet. And of course, the best-selling content for a lot of these creators is standoffs and fights. Over the last decade, the space has been frequently used by Islamic militants and hate preachers. One of these speakers turned out to be a close friend of one of the London Bridge attackers. And another speaker was found out to have been using the platform to recruit terrorists, one of whom was found guilty of plotting to behead a soldier in 2015. And on the other end, Speaker's Corner was used to hold a free speech rally by none other than Tommy Robinson, which in classic Tommy fashion resulted in his supporters manhandling another speaker away from his platform, as well as a bit of the old square go and kicking f*** out of some cunts. I find this interesting because it shows two opposing positions on free speech, but kind of makes them look like they're two sides of the same coin. Do we want a completely free marketplace of ideas where anyone and everyone has a right to attend? Or do we treat some ideas as so counterproductive that the only sensible thing to do is remove them from the space? Because in this case, it looks like the former idea necessarily produces the latter. The idea of absolute freedom of speech extended to Tommy Robinson, and Tommy Robinson's freedom resulted in other people losing their right to speak at the hands of his supporters. So, should we still allow people to speak for as long as they're willing to forego the violence, even in cases when the violence seems kind of inevitable? Or do we trust some arbitrary benevolent actors to decide for us which speech is acceptable and which isn't? How should they decide that? Who gets to decide that? Can we have an ethically consistent view on who gets to speak and who doesn't? Does ethical consistency even matter? I don't know, but let's find out. But first, this video is sponsored by Atlas VPN. Is your New Year's resolution to not get bothered by pop-up ads, malware, and other such internet carry-on? Well, it sounds like you need a virtual private network, aka a VPN, so you can stay protected while you're online. Not only does Atlas VPN notify you when someone is trying to steal your data, block malicious links, and mask your identity online, it also allows you to browse the internet from other countries, giving you access to geo-restricted content that you normally wouldn't be able to access at home. And you can use it on your laptop, your phone, your TV, or your desktop. And that's just science, dude. Are you as late to buy your Christmas presents as I was to make this video? No problem. With the link in the description, you can still access Atlas VPN's Christmas and New Year deal, where you'll get Atlas VPN Premium for $1.70 a month, plus 6 months extra for free. That's literally a small amount of money. And there's a 30-day money-back guarantee. So, have a good New Year, click the link in the description where you can access the deal now, and have a safe 2023. So, one of the articles I read for this video was titled, "Extremists Hijack Speaker's Corner." The first paragraph read, "The reputation of Speaker's Corner as a bastion of free expression is being abused by those with extreme views who use it to promote their agendas." Reading that, my first thought was, isn't that the point? Wasn't that also the point when people like Marx and Lenin were speaking in a time when other countries in Europe would have happily seen them behind bars? That's the entire purpose of advocating for free speech. It's to protect people whose ideas are a social taboo. It's not like our Yankoid cousins came up with the First Amendment just so they could defend your right to advocate for improving the road system. No. They did it to defend your right to say the most insane bullshit in the town square without getting burned at the stake. But obviously, the examples from Speaker's Corner do raise questions about whether or not there are limits to that right. Is it really acceptable to allow a speaker up onto the soapbox if he's only using that right to recruit terrorists? Or when Tommy Robinson goes there, is the presence of him and his followers not always going to produce a situation where no one gets to speak? I think Speaker's Corner is a really good starting point here because a lot of the issues that can be easily obscured online become much more apparent when we see them playing out in the town square. And now that social media platforms are starting to see themselves as the new town square, the question arises over whether one's right to free speech extends to their right to speak freely into a megaphone. Or do we have a responsibility to protect people from rhetoric that causes demonstrable harm?
Get to the point!
Okay. So there are the people who think we should deplatform reactionaries to keep vulnerable groups safe.
It was one of these debate folks that was like, the solution is not deplatforming because we need to defeat their ideas in they need to be defeated in the marketplace of ideas. And no, that's stupid. That's not what you do here.
And there are the people who think free speech should come first.
Mr. Big Tech, Mr. Big Tech, can you please get rid of the people that I don't like? Thank you, Mr. Corporation.
Fuck off!
Now, I think both of these sides maybe have a point. Now me, I love freedom of speech. I am a free speech cuck, and I think any discussion around this should never be losing sight of that core value. I am an unironic believer in the fabled free marketplace of ideas, but I do still think there is a degree of deplatforming which is acceptable. How is this possible? Well, because I believe that if you really want a free marketplace of ideas, then some degree of deplatforming is not only acceptable, but also necessary. If you want to know what the f I mean by that, stay. So, if you think free speech deserves a kind of special privilege in society, you've probably been tempted at some point by the idea of free speech absolutism. This is the idea that any and all speech should be allowed on any platform so long as it doesn't break the law. Now, this seems like a fairly simple and noble idea, but the problem is no one really believes it. It shouldn't take long to think of a few offenses that are easily bannable but probably shouldn't be illegal. Spam is bannable on almost every platform, although I don't think anyone would say that should be illegal. Even 4chan of all places has a TOS against spamming or posting irrelevant content in particular boards. They even had to make a standalone rule against posting pony or brony threads outside of the My Little Pony boards, because a bunch of degenerates just couldn't stop spamming other boards with their content. The free speech capital of the internet had to ban cartoon pictures of f***ing ponies. Even they understand that the law doesn't cover everything. Pornography isn't illegal, but it's probably okay to keep it off of places like YouTube. Doxing, believe it or not, isn't illegal in several countries, although I imagine most people would probably be okay with it being against the terms of service. And call me a crazy leftist, but I also think posts containing certain hacked material, i.e. pictures of Hunter Biden's dongus, are also bannable. You know, probably not the kind of thing we need to be seeing in the town square, regardless of how much it might tickle your public interest. The badly kept secret here is that everyone is okay with some level of deplatforming. Barring that last example, the right are probably okay with most of what I've just mentioned, as well as all their weird 1984 Wellian don't say gay bills and banning of public drag shows. If someone who spent the last 5 years complaining about how the left hates free speech doesn't denounce shit like this, then f*** them. As for the deplatforming advocates on the left, well, let's talk about that. First of all, the deplatforming of reactionary content is a relatively new thing. The first broad move to take down far-right communities was the banning of several racist and fat-shaming subreddits in 2015. Most notably r/fatpeoplehate, as well as a bunch of smaller ones with names like, those ones. The result was an immediate reduction in hateful speech on the platform as regular posters either reduced their activity or just left Reddit completely. Reddit has since continued to take this approach towards hateful content, even banning some of the larger subs like r/incels and r/thedonald. From 2018 to 2019, YouTube conducted its own purge of far-right creators. Starting most famously with the banning of Alex Jones, over 11,000 channels were removed from the platform in just 22 months. The result was most of these creators moving to BitChute, where there was less regulation, but also a fraction of the audience. Despite the website's owner boasting about a surge of new users and financial gains for his platform, the viewership they enjoyed compared to YouTube was negligible. This is essentially the standard argument in favor of deplatforming reactionaries. The gist is, deplatforming works. Look at what happened to Milo, Stefan Molyneux, Richard Spencer, this guy whose name you probably can't even remember, Nick Fuente. Well, maybe not that one, but it's probably still safe to say that his success came in spite of being deplatformed. If he was allowed back on YouTube, he's hardly going to say no. In any case, examples like this tend to be more like exceptions that prove the rule. There's really no getting around the fact that being deplatformed is incredibly demoralizing. It wrecks your income, and rebuilding an audience on an obscure platform is going to be near impossible unless you already have an incredibly loyal fanbase. This is not some fantasy anime world where people can get banished into the shadows only to return more powerful than we ever imagined. The question is destroying the careers of people with harmful ideas really the goal in and of itself? Well, no. And as much as I don't like the thoughts in his brain, I don't really take any pleasure in watching Sneeko lose his platform on YouTube, especially if it's just being done for its own sake. If I was going to take away someone else's freedom, I think I'd need a better reason for that. And I'm sure you're thinking something like, come on, Lonerbox. It's not about hurting Sneeko's career, it's about hurting his reach. Him losing his platform means less people are exposed to his ideas. And the ideas of his friends. The reason we deplatform people is to stop those harmful ideas from spreading. And, okay, let's talk about that. The idea that deplatforming limits the reach of a creator is undeniable, and every study I've read on this supports that. However, what every study I've read on this also argues is that deplatforming comes with a price. When r/thedonald and r/incels were removed from Reddit, both of these communities migrated to their own standalone websites which were far less moderated. A recent study on both of these sites showed that although deplatforming reduced their numbers, the remaining posters in these communities became significantly more toxic and more radicalized. A similar study looking at users who migrated to Gab after being banned from Twitter and Reddit also found that not only did these users become more toxic, but that they also started posting a lot more frequently. A common result of deplatforming is that it actually strengthens the resolve of more committed audience members. Creators wear their bans as a badge of honor. For conspiratorial figures, it becomes proof that their ideas were correct all along. It drags audiences into a space where they become more isolated, less exposed to alternative ideas, and more vulnerable to unmoderated content. It strengthens the bond amongst communities and leaves creators with an audience that might be smaller, but is also more loyal and committed to the cause. One of the findings that came out of the Alex Jones trial was that InfoWars actually made more money after being banned from Twitter and YouTube in 2018. Nick Fuentes was banned from almost everything and still managed to drag his legion of bedwetters to the Capitol on January 6th. This is a warning sign that shows up constantly in the research, and while I don't think it completely invalidates deplatforming, I do think it calls for a more nuanced approach. The problem with content moderation is that the process is naturally siloed. Moderators only ban people based on the effects it will have on their own platform. What they don't consider is the effect that deplatforming can have on the broader online ecosystem. Deplatforming might make audiences smaller, but the impact of pushing people into more extreme and isolated spaces shouldn't be ignored. The association between alternative communities and offline violent attacks is very well known. And if deplatforming also means that these communities grow as a result, this is probably a measure that should be used with some caution. As one study put it, moderation efforts should go beyond ensuring the safety of users on a single platform, taking into account the potential adverse effects of banning users on major platforms. Here's how I would put it. Let's say this is our mainstream marketplace of ideas, and these smaller circles are creators and their core communities. Now, let's start deplatforming some people because their ideas are too harmful. They lose most of their viewers and they're cast out into the shadows. But let's say we get a bit trigger happy. Maybe we'll get rid of this person and maybe the old rip bozo on these people, and inevitably, this unmoderated, wretched hive of scum and villainy is going to keep growing. And the question is, how big are we willing to let this alternative universe grow before it becomes an even uglier version of the very thing we sought to destroy? That too dramatic? Bearing in mind, we haven't been deplatforming people for very long, and some people would argue that this unintended consequence is already starting to show. Alternative platforms are still small, but they are growing. Gab doubled in size within a year of January 6th. When Facebook banned groups discussing COVID-19 vaccines, those same users migrated to Twitter where they posted at higher rates. Rumble's user base grew by 76% between 2021 and 2022, and the amount of uploaded content on the platform nearly tripled. After watching the recent anti-Semitic ramblings of Kanye West, particularly in the company of these two droogs, it was almost easy to forget that all three of these people had been extensively deplatformed. Anti-Semitism as a whole has been extensively deplatformed. Things like the Jewish question and Holocaust denial have been some of the top targets for social media bans. They've been so taboo for so long that even most right-wing commentators won't go near them, but can we say how much that's really helped? Jewish people have consistently been the top targets for hate crimes in the English-speaking world, and it looks like the hateful ideas that produce those attacks have been with us the entire time. The risk of banishing too many people to these alternative spaces too quickly is that they become more cemented in their beliefs, more radicalized, and more willing to violently assert those beliefs in the real world. And I feel like people on the left already kind of understand this. They'll argue that the spread of far-right politics has less to do with individual figureheads and is more of a manifestation of our current liberal, racial, patriarchal, capitalist order, and yes, I agree with all of those words. So it makes me wonder why you would celebrate the deplatforming of far-right individuals whilst the material conditions that sustain their beliefs can carry on uninterrupted. because it does often feel like deplatforming has only changed the nature of the problem rather than dealt with it. Only now, the far right gets to have the privilege of appealing to our progressive ideas of free speech whilst advocating for a world that would ultimately destroy those values. And I don't like that. So the question becomes, how do we have an ethical position on deplatforming that doesn't compromise the principles of free speech? And I'm sure you've been thinking about it, so maybe it's time for the paradox of tolerance. Whenever I hear people invoke the paradox of tolerance, I always just want to do the annoying thing and ask, well, what do you mean by tolerance? But I think it's a valid question. When we say intolerant, do we mean prejudiced? Bigoted against certain religious, national, or minority groups? Because if we're deplatforming people for that, then the internet will become a very quiet place very quickly. Personally, I think everyone from the center-right onwards is at least a little bit intolerant. I think liberals can be quite intolerant. I think a lot of leftists are kind of intolerant. Tankies are very f***ing intolerant. So yeah, it would be worth explaining what we mean by intolerant. Maybe we could just read the original text. Which we can, because Karl Popper's theory on the paradox of tolerance is, it's a footnote. Like it's this paragraph. That's it. He starts with a simple warning. Unlimited tolerance must lead to the disappearance of tolerance. If we extend unlimited tolerance even to those who are intolerant, if we are not prepared to defend a tolerant society against the onslaught of the intolerant, then the tolerant will be destroyed and tolerance with them. So that's all good. That's the basic theory. The problem is, he doesn't say what the fuck he means by intolerant. Instead, he only gives us a couple of clues. I do not imply, for instance, that we should always suppress the utterance of intolerant philosophies. As long as we can counter them by rational argument and keep them in check by public opinion, suppression would certainly be most unwise. But we should claim the right even to suppress them, for it may easily turn out that they are not prepared to meet us on the level of rational argument, but begin by denouncing all argument. They may forbid their followers to listen to anything as deceptive as rational argument, and teach them to answer arguments by use of their fists. So already he seems to be against the idea of suppressing intolerant philosophies, so long as they can be countered by rational argument. Now, for me, I think all intolerant philosophies can be countered by rational argument. And I know some of you might say that you can't reason someone out of an argument they weren't reasoned into, but I don't know how I feel about treating that as a hard rule. At least, I'd like to think the 20% of American millennials and Zoomers who think Jews caused the Holocaust aren't doomed to feel that way forever. And I think most people already understand that. Even for the most extreme irrational positions, the proponents of those ideas might be acting in bad faith. But that doesn't mean everyone in the audience is. If they were, then Sean's career would have been a complete waste of time. But that's the value in videos like these, isn't it? It's that they can reason people out of unreasonable positions. People can believe all kinds of unreasonable shit, but they can also reevaluate. They can take a more rational approach later. And whether you're doing video essays or debates, isn't one of the goals often to plant the seeds of doubt? For Popper, it feels like he's arguing that intolerant actors really become a problem when they denounce all arguments, forbid their followers to listen to rational argument, and teach them to answer arguments by use of their fists. Now, to me, and I am putting my own spin on this because fuck you, I think a good general rule should be deplatform people for intolerant behavior, not intolerant ideas. And this is where I think Tommy Robinson is a perfect example. Now, why is it so easy to defend the banning of someone like Tommy? Because I would argue that the best reason for his deplatforming was not his ideas. Of course, his ideas are awful, but they could have been a lot worse. If you were to catch Tommy on his best behavior, he would probably say something like this. Islam is a religion that hasn't reformed in the same way other faiths have. It holds people to a standard that hasn't been updated since the 7th century, and that isn't compatible with a secular democratic society. Fuck. I'm not saying all Muslims are like that, but it's enough that we have grooming gangs, terrorists, Sharia courts, etc. Meanwhile, Sikhs have integrated, Hindus have integrated, Hindus have integrated, Jews have integrated. I'm sure Muslims can integrate, but they haven't. I'm not saying it's all Muslims, I'm just saying there are problems here, and what we should do is stop Muslim immigration and work with the Muslim community until we can get around these problems. Now, he has said things a lot more inflammatory than that, but his worldview isn't anywhere near the worst you could find online. As far as I know, he's not a Holocaust denier, he doesn't espouse race realism, Nazis hate him, although that might just be because he supports Israel. The thing that makes Tommy exceptionally bad is not so much his opinions, but the way he practices those opinions. His YouTube content thrived on aggressive confrontations in public. He would film himself screaming in people's faces. He would start fights and deceptively edit them to make himself look like the victim. He filmed himself doxing a journalist and banging on his door in the middle of the night. He used his platform to defame a 15-year-old Syrian refugee. It's safe to say he wasn't here just to share ideas. When he went to Speaker's Corner, his followers made sure that opposing voices were shut down. And that's the point. When he does have the right to speak, he uses it to make sure that other people don't. That's why he doesn't deserve a platform. We don't justify the banning of people like Tommy because we're sacrificing free speech. We do it in defense of free speech. Let's go back to our town square. Theoretically, as long as everyone is just there to preach their ideas and people are only engaging in arguments that they've consented to have, I think people should be allowed to discuss whatever idea they please. But if this community of green people decides to approach a smaller group of pink people and harass them out of the space, then at that point you either have to take free speech away from the harassers or sit back and let them take it away from the people they're harassing. This is why free speech absolutism and a marketplace of ideas are incompatible. Unfortunately, intolerance doesn't stop at people just preaching intolerant philosophies. Some actors and communities will only appeal to free speech for as long as they can use it to dox, defame, brigade, threaten, bully, and harass others out of public discourse. For the truly intolerant, free speech is a weapon, not a value. And when they join in, you can't have free speech for them and for their targets at the same time. At that point, you have to make a choice. And that choice should be to ban all the queer people. I'm sorry. Personally, if people just want to discuss their batshit ideas in the town square, I think they should be allowed to. But the moment they start to practice those ideas at the expense of other people's right to speak, then I hardly think they can call you a hypocrite when you say that the marketplace of ideas probably isn't for them. Or if they go really far and try to build some kind of intolerant, authoritarian, anti-free speech political party out of those ideas, well, you can watch this old video I made for that one. This has been the most difficult video to record my Hachoo. So I'm just going to close this by offering a few suggestions. There is an argument for the use of soft moderation that does seem to have a bit of research behind it. One of the problems we have now is that toxic content has a natural advantage in the algorithm. Anger is one of, if not the easiest emotion to trigger in someone, so posts that make you angry are the ones that tend to get the most engagement. It would make sense then for platforms to adjust their algorithms so that the internet doesn't just become a cesspit for humanity's worst excesses. And this pursuit of a more ethical algorithm has already been happening, and the results haven't been terrible. One study showed that an algorithmic change on YouTube in 2019 resulted in conspiratorial recommendations dropping by 40% over 15 months. Following Biden's election, a study on electoral fraud conspiracies on Twitter found that tweets with warning labels and fact-checking tags were more likely to get replies from people correcting their claims or mocking the original poster. In a similar study on COVID-19, over 300 participants were asked to judge the accuracy of various tweets discussing the vaccine. This one didn't so much support warning labels, but did argue that interstitial covers, these things, were effective in reducing the perceived accuracy of COVID misinformation. The point is, soft and hard moderation of this kind of content is still fairly new, and if there is a risk of growing alternative platforms too quickly by being too trigger-happy with the deplatforming button, there are other options worth exploring. Because if the alternative is a standard that could make 40% of people in the United States unfit for social media, well, how? Because the truth is, a lot of people believe a lot of insane shit. And if we decide that these people can no longer engage in public discourse or that no amount of communication can change their minds, then what? Do we just kill them? I mean, not that. Do we just have people split off into completely separate spaces where everyone just reinforces each other's beliefs? Is that not kind of already starting to happen? This is where I think people on the left can be a bit too quick to forego the principle of free speech. Conservatives and far-right people will always try to appeal to our values, but it does get a bit frustrating when they try to say the left hates free speech and the response is all too often a yes, Giga Chad rip bozo. Yes, there are actors who will try to use their platforms to hurt the free speech rights of vulnerable people, but that should be our reason for banning them. It's a tool that should be used when bad actors force us to choose between their freedom and the freedom of the people they're attacking. The point of deplatforming is that it should be used to defend free speech, not something that we abuse in spite of it. When Voltaire said that thing about how what you say might be cringe, but not letting you say it would be even more cringe, that quote's actually from his biographer, not him. I think that's a standard worth pushing for. It should be, say what you want, as long as you're willing to let others do the same.